um, and we'll give a couple of minutes for students to join in. Meanwhile, so only one student is here. Kaushik, if you have any questions from last time or anything, feel free to ask.
Yes, sir. I was just wondering what is the main reason for Earth's magnetic field?
Yes, the discussion on happening on
Yes,
Teams. Well,
yes.
the Earth's magnetic. Yogesh, do you want to take that? So the discussion started off by someone asking. I think Kaushik, was that also you? Why is there a magnetic field for neutron stars? And
Yes, sir.
yeah, so Yogesh, maybe you can
So,
answer that first.
yeah, so one easy way of there's a magnetic field for stars, okay, in general. Okay, and exactly how the magnetic field is produced and how it is sustained is a matter of a bit of debate still. But it is the magnetic field of the star which survives as the magnetic field of a white dwarf or of a black hole and so on. So it is, you can think of it as the magnetic field of a star is stronger than that of the Earth. But if a star which is million kilometers in diameter shrinks to 10 kilometers, then naturally the strength of the magnetic field is going to go up. Just like the density goes up manifold, the magnetic field also goes up, and it becomes of the order of 10 raised to 12 Gauss. Now, exactly how that magnetic field is produced in stars, as I said, is a matter of debate, right? It is definitely related to the solar cycles. It is the presence of sunspots is related to the magnetic field of the sun, and so on. So it's a bit complicated to explain. Primarily, I mean, for two reasons. One is nobody really understands, and I don't understand fully what other people understand.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
I had a question from the last class, so can I ask?
Yeah, go ahead.
So, how do we actually measure the magnetic field?
How do you actually measure the magnetic field? Okay. So in most cases, there is a proxy that is used. Okay. If you don't do polarization studies, then most people use an assumption which is known as the equipartition assumption. Okay, which talks about how the energy density is partitioned between the energy of the particles in a particular volume and the energy of the magnetic field. And there are some reasons to believe that this energy will be partitioned in equal proportions. So if you can measure the energy density of a particular volume, you can then claim that half of it will be in the form of the magnetic field, and half of it will be in the form of the energy of the particles. So you can then use the energy equipartition theorem to claim that to determine indirectly how much magnetic field there is. But it's a tricky business because it is not clear whether equipartition holds in all situations, and whether a particular situation is present in a particular case. So it's all hand waving. I mean, if you can get the magnetic field to an order of magnitude, people say, fine, we are consistent with what the expectation is. But with polarization, you can measure the magnetic field directly using the rotation measures.
Okay.
What about P dot and pulsar magnetic fields, Yogesh?
Yeah, so pulsar magnetic fields, again, you can use some kind of energy arguments because you can plot what is called the PP dot diagram of pulsars, which means you plot the period of the pulsar on one axis and the rate of change of the period on another axis, right? And from P dot, you can determine how much energy is being lost by the system or gained by the system if it is being spun up. And then you can use that to determine how much magnetic field energy there is and calculate how much magnetic field there is. So again, we know definitely to a factor of 10 what the magnetic field is. In some situations, we know to a better than a factor of 2.
Okay, thanks. So let's get started with today's lecture. And again, Yogesh Vardekar from NCRA is going to pick up where we had stopped last time. And towards the end, I have some announcements to make about the NSEM and Project Vivas and remaining lectures. Over to you again, Yogesh. Thanks.
Yes. Thank you, Varun. So we'll start off where we left off last time. We were saying that we looked at last time what are the kind of objects in the universe that can be radio sources. And we looked at pulsars and radio galaxies and so on. There are a lot, as I was saying, a lot of faint radio sources, which are basically often manifestations of the same phenomenon, but on lower energetic scales. So for example, many Seyfert galaxies are like the low luminosity counterparts of radio galaxies and so on. Right. So before we continue, a little bit on note on fluxes in radio astronomy. There is a special unit used for flux in radio astronomy, which is 1 Jansky, which is an incredibly small number. It is 10 raised to minus 26 watts per meter square per hertz. Okay, so this is not really flux, but flux density, because it's the amount of flux per unit frequency per hertz. Okay. Radio sources are exceedingly faint. By modern standards, a 1 Jansky source is a very bright source. So we often talk of millijansky, microjansky, and nowadays increasingly nanojansky, very, 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 very faint sources. It is often said that if you take a piece of paper and drop it to the floor and you bend down and you pick it up, you have expended more energy than all the energy received by all the radio telescopes across the world in the last 50 years. Okay, so that's how small things are. So when you say nanojansky, that is like 10 raised to minus 35 watt per meter square per hertz. Very, very low energy. The radio waves themselves are very low energy. And on top of that, we are trying to detect radio waves coming from the other end of the universe. So they're really, really low in flux. One can make, if one makes a radio image, this is an example of a radio image. It's about half a degree on the y-axis and about a degree on the x-axis. There are many, many sources, little black dots that you see. Each one is an individual radio source. And there are more than 100 individual radio sources that you see here. Some of them are sort of clearly seem to be related to each other. So this one is a distant radio galaxy. Okay, it has 2 radio lobes. Right. So, but as you can see that even the most sensitive radio images are quite sparse, in the sense that most of the sky is essentially blank. And you can actually, but that doesn't mean it doesn't contain any information. You can you can make a median stack of at different positions corresponding to known objects and make a detection of the median or the mean properties of that class of objects. So what you see here is an image which was constructed from data of the VLA first survey by stacking together 200,000 quasars. So at the positions of 200,000 quasars, each of which may not have been individually detected in the radio. If you stack the radio data at each of those positions and construct a median stack image, then you see a clear detection, as you see over here. That black object is represents the median flux from all of these 200,000 quasars. Okay, so far with the radio, we've looked only at what is called continuum imaging, not imaging with spectral lines. So is spectral line imaging possible with a radio telescope? The answer is yes. And that is primarily enabled by what is called the H1 line emission and absorption. So if you have a hydrogen atom with an electron orbiting the proton at the center with parallel spins, as has been shown here, that configuration has a slightly higher energies than when the spins are anti-parallel. Okay, so if atom transitions from this sort of parallel spin state to an anti-parallel spin state, a photon gets emitted, okay, because it's moving to a lower energy state. And the difference in energy between the two states is so small that the photon emitted has a very low energy. It is emitted in the radio and has a frequency of about 1420 megahertz. Now, the probability of this transition happening in any one atom spontaneously is very, very small. But since hydrogen is by far the most abundant element in the universe, and hydrogen is present almost everywhere at all pressures, temperatures, and densities, you should be able to, if there is sufficient amount of hydrogen, you should be able to see this transition. There are some other molecules like carbon monoxide, water, and OH, the OH ion, which also have transitions that emit in the radio. So many of these are not hyperfine transitions like the one of hydrogen that we've just been talking about, but these are some kind of rotational transitions between two different rotational energy states of these molecules. And they span the entire radio range. Carbon monoxide is a very, very ubiquitous molecule. And also there is a correlation between the amount of carbon dioxide and the amount of hydrogen. So by measuring the amount of carbon dioxide, we can find out how much hydrogen there is at a particular location. So at higher radio frequencies, what are called the sub-millimeter and millimeter bands, there these CO transitions are very commonly seen. And telescopes, newer telescopes such as the ALMA telescope, use these kind of transitions to trace the distribution of carbon monoxide and therefore indirectly trace the distribution and abundance of hydrogen. The H1 can be used to find out the amount of hydrogen there is, but it can also be used to measure its kinematics. So so what you see here at the center is a small dwarf galaxy as seen in the optical. And all this sort of bluish stuff that you see all around is the neutral hydrogen gas that surrounds this particular dwarf galaxy and is, as you can see, spread out over a much larger extent than the optical extent of the galaxy. So we can use, now if this gas is not just sitting there, but it is moving, let us say it is rotating in the same direction as the galaxy is rotating, one will be able to see the Doppler shift in the gas. So the part of the galaxy that is moving towards us will be blue shifted. The part of the gas that's moving away from us will be red shifted. And using the blue, by measuring the Doppler shift, one can measure the speeds with which the galaxy is rotating. So one can therefore obtain the kinematics of dark matter, okay, of the gas, and through that obtain the distribution not just of the baryonic visible matter in this galaxy, but also the dark matter in this galaxy. So in fact, for studies of dark matter, the distribution of dark matter in galaxies, these H1 based tracers of the atomic hydrogen are very important. With a radio telescope, one can explore the evolution of hydrogen in its various phases across the history of the universe. Of course, soon after the Big Bang, the hydrogen was all ionized. Okay. Eventually, as the universe expanded, it cooled, and at some point, perhaps about 380,000 years ago, you have what is called the last scattering surface, or the epoch of the cosmic microwave background. And at that point, matter radiation and radiation decoupled, and ions came together, protons and electrons came together and formed neutral hydrogen atoms across the universe. And then, of course, at some point, the first stars formed, and then you had an epoch of reionization. So the blue here represents the neutral hydrogen, and the sort of pink or magenta color represents the ionized hydrogen. And so eventually stars and galaxies formed everywhere in the universe, and the universe got fully reionized. But by using a radio telescope, a very sensitive radio telescope, one can trace the evolution of neutral hydrogen across cosmic epoch. So we can figure out exactly when the first stars came out, okay, and when did they start ionizing the universe? How long did it take? Was it a very short period of time, or was it a very long extended period of time? All of this can be observationally studied by using this H1 line that we have looked at. So it's a very, very important tool in radio astronomy. So now I will talk a bit about radio telescopes, and I'll specifically focus on the telescope that we have at hand, which is the Giant Meter Wave Radio Telescope. Govind Swarup, as I told you last time, this GMRT is his brainchild. And he used to say that the GMRT is a marriage of the two world's big radio telescopes, the Very Large Array in New Mexico and the Arecibo telescope in Puerto Rico, with the advantages of both. So here is the telescope at Arecibo in Puerto Rico. Some of you may have heard about the tragic collapse of the whole secondary support system onto the dish of the telescope, and the telescope is no longer functional. But while it was working, it was really a great instrument. It's sitting in a natural hollow in the ground, and it is 300 meters in diameter. So it's a single dish, okay? And the Chinese have now built an even bigger dish. Instead of 300 meters, they have a 500-meter single dish telescope called FAST in southern China. So this is a single dish telescope. It has an advantage that its collecting area is very high, so it can detect very, very faint signals. Using Arecibo, naturally people have done experiments to try and determine, try and make contact with alien life forms. So there have been radio signals that have been transmitted from Arecibo. And also it's also a radar and ionospheric instrument, so it's capable of transmission, and also to try and search for very faint signals coming from alien civilizations elsewhere. Of course, they didn't find anything, but this is a very sensitive telescope. The other telescope is of a different design, which is called as a interferometer. And as we shall see shortly, there are some advantages that make interferometers very attractive over single dish telescopes. So what you have here is there are 27 dishes. You don't see all of them in this picture. But what can be done is that these dishes are along 3 arms. There's one arm going this way, there's another arm going this way, and a third arm going this way. And the beauty of this telescope is that the dishes themselves, they're not very small, but they're mounted on the rails. So there is like a railway track going all out, and it is possible to move the telescopes to the most compact configuration, which you see here. And it's also possible to move them out to fairly large distances so that you can change the resolution of the telescope. It's a very, very versatile telescope built in the 1980s. And the GMRT was modeled as a lower radio frequency counterpart of this very large array telescope in New Mexico. It's of course VLA has been upgraded, just like the GMRT was upgraded recently. And both of these telescopes are now functioning with their new upgrades. So here's a picture of the GMRT. We work at lower radio frequencies than the VLA. Our dishes are much larger in size. We have each dish which is 45 meters in diameter. But because these dishes are so large, they're also quite heavy. They're too heavy to be mounted on rails and moved around. So all of our dishes are fixed. Okay. We operate at lower radio frequencies, and therefore we don't actually need a filled aperture dish. Okay. Just like the UTI radio telescope that I showed you last time, the GMRT is the reflecting surface of the GMRT is a wire mesh. So what is it? It's 30 dishes of 45 meters diameter each. The longest baseline is about 25 kilometers. The baseline one means the maximum separation between two of the dishes. And the shortest separation is about 100 meters. Dishes are not solid, they have a mesh. And what are the advantages of a mesh? First of all, low construction costs, low operational costs, and less wind loading. If you made a solid dish of this large size and there was a strong wind, then the wind loading would create significant difficulties. The UGMRT operates in 4 operating bands. The highest frequency is between 1000 and 1450 megahertz. The next frequency is between 550 and 900 megahertz. And the next one is between 250 and 500 megahertz. And the last one is between 120 and 250 megahertz. And shown in brackets are the bands, the previous bands of the legacy GMRT. So when we carried out an upgrade of the GMRT over the last few years, the main thing we did was we allowed seamless frequency megahertz at the lowest frequency.
Yogesh, we lost your last sentence.
Okay.
So starting from when we upgraded.
So when we upgraded, we basically, before the upgrade, we had only about 32 megahertz of bandwidth observable at one time. What we've done in the upgrade is that we've changed things so that we can observe about 400 megahertz at the same time. So there has been a greater than 10-fold improvement in the instantaneous bandwidth, and therefore we can observe, there are many astrophysical phenomena that can be observed better and at higher sensitivity with this high bandwidth. Okay, so here's a picture of the GMRT mesh. These are stainless steel wires, very, very thin wires. separated by about 8 or 9 millimeters. So these little squares, if you are able to see them, they're about 9 millimeters on a side. And the whole entire dish, 45-meter diameter dish, is covered with this very fine stainless steel wire mesh. At the top of the dish is a rotating feed system, where different feeds operating in the different frequency bands can be pointed towards the dish. So if you're observing in the L band, you will point the L band feed at the dish, so that the L band frequencies are collected cleanly. If you're observing at one of the other bands, you will turn this feed system and point the appropriate feed towards the dish. The GMRT antennas are fixed in position. About half of the 30 dishes are located in what we call as the central square, which is a 1 square kilometer area. And you can see those sort of little white circles. Each white circle represents is a photograph. This is a Google Sky image of the dishes. But if you zoom out, and so this is the 1 square kilometer area, but spread out over a much larger area in a Y shape, similar to the GMRT. We'll come to in a few minutes why this Y shape is very useful in Earth rotation aperture synthesis. But it's basically, we have a western arm, we have an eastern arm, and we have a southern arm. And this is in addition to the about half the dishes being located in that central square kilometer. This one is just here, and we've zoomed out now, and we can see the dishes in the western arm, the southern arm, and the eastern arm. So how does a radio telescope work? Okay, the working of a radio telescope is not very different from the working of a transistor radio. So those of you who have studied electronics in school or college will recognize this kind of block diagram. So you have radio frequency being received by the dish. Okay, it goes through a radio frequency or RF amplifier. Okay, so you have now the amplified radio frequency signal. You mix that with a local oscillator signal coming out of a local oscillator. Okay, and then that leads to a sort of beat frequency out between the RF and the LO, and that creates this modulated intermediate frequency signal, which can then be further amplified. Okay, it can also be transmitted relatively easily to a central electronics building where you can have a second local oscillator, and that changes the frequency down from the intermediate frequency to what is called the baseband frequency. So the advantage of having a common baseband is that then the baseband electronics which you put into the back end is going to be common, whether you're observing between let's say 1000 megahertz to 1400 megahertz, or you're observing from 120 megahertz to 520 megahertz. It doesn't matter. The back-end electronics is the same, because by configuring the LO2 and the LO1, you can bring the frequency down to 0 to 400 megahertz in each case. Right. So the GMRT is what is called as an open sky international facility. By open sky, which one means that time on the telescope is awarded purely on the basis of merit. There is no reservation even for people at NCRA of telescope time. Everybody has to compete in the open. So proposals are invited twice a year. We have 2 cycles of 5 months each, followed by a 1 month long maintenance period. Each proposal gets reviewed by expert reviewers from across the world. As I said, we have an open sky policy. We have about 75 odd proposals that get received in each cycle. Cycle 1 started in 2002 and cycle 40 is going to start very soon. And astronomers from 35 nations have used GMRT so far. And I think this map illustrates the importance of GMRT because we have users from both North and South America, most of the countries of Europe, and also China, Russia, Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, Japan, etc. In the eastern part. So you can see that this is a facility that is being used by astronomers from all the advanced countries of the world. And this may be, in some sense, the only major international physics facility that is widely used by, that is located in India, but is used by users from across the world. Here are some titles of GMRT proposals from a few cycles ago. Okay, so there are people who want to study coherent emission from magnetic B-type stars, people who want to study core collapse supernovae, people who are looking for methanol in the center of the Milky Way, at feedback through massive stars using radio recombination lines, search for superflares and coronal mass ejections on stars, confirming a special kind of millisecond pulsar, an ultra steep spectrum pulsar, high glitch rate pulsars, studies of dwarf galaxies, cluster mergers, neutral gas in active galaxies, very deep field observations of certain parts of the sky, properties of radio loud quasars, and even a pilot proposal for a search for advanced extraterrestrial life with the upgraded GMRT. Okay, so you can see that this is a telescope that is receiving a very rich diversity of proposals from a very, very diverse international community of users. Okay, so now we'll look at some of the sort of features of an interferometer and why an interferometer is very useful. Right, so the angular resolution of a telescope is its ability to separate two objects that are very close to each other. Okay, so suppose you have, so this, what is represented on the y-axis is the intensity, and on the x-axis is sort of the spatial distribution. So imagine you have two stars here, one star here and another star here. Both are point sources, but because of diffraction, their image is what is called, turns into what is called as an airy disk. Now, if the two airy disks of the two stars are well separated from each other, you'll be able to see them as separate stars. There will be a limit where you can just barely resolve the two objects as separate stars. That is referred to as the Rayleigh limit. But if the objects are closer than that, it becomes very difficult to separate them out into as two separate objects. We call them unresolved objects. So naturally, if you want to separate objects that are very close to each other, you want to have high resolution. And it's not just the ability to separate two objects, but even if you are looking at two different parts of the same object. So if you are looking at star forming regions in one galaxy, for example, if the star forming regions are not resolved, you will see the flux from them just added up as one, and you won't be able to see the distribution within the galaxy. But if you have a sufficiently high resolution, as in A, you'll be able to separate out the star forming regions cleanly. The resolution of any telescope is given by 1.22 lambda by D. Okay, so if you have a single dish or a single element optical telescope, if you plug in the lambda of the optical, and the diameter of the optical, you'll get the resolution. And this, of course, will be, sorry, these are both in meters or units of length. And therefore, this will be a dimensionless quantity, but it will actually be in radians. Okay. So in the optical, a 10 centimeter diameter telescope, you plug in the as 10 centimeters and optical lambda, that you'll get a resolution of about 1 arc second, right? At meter wavelengths, remember last time we worked this out, that when we are observing in the radio, we are observing at frequencies that are about 2 million times lower than in the optical. So one would need to have, if your lambda is 2 million times larger, your D also has to be 2 million times larger to gain the same resolution. So if you want a 1 arc second resolution with a single dish radio telescope, you need a 200 kilometer, 2 million times larger diameter, which is a 200 kilometer diameter dish for the same resolution, right? So this clearly is deeply impractical. It would be impossible to construct, not to say anything about the astronomical cost. But it turns out that there is a trick that one can use, and that trick is basically to use not a single dish, but many, many different dishes. When you do that, then the D you have to consider is not the diameter of the individual dishes, but the distance or the maximum distance between two dishes. So for the GMRT, we saw that the maximum separation is about 25 kilometers. So the GMRT then would become, in terms of resolution, equivalent to a single dish 25 kilometers in diameter. And that really makes things interesting. So when you have the simplest interferometer you can build is one with two dishes. So consider you have, let's say, a GMRT dish at this position where nu2t is marked, and another GMRT dish at where nu1t is marked. Okay, these two black spots represent the two dishes. And let us imagine a radio wave which is coming from infinity and hitting these receptors. So given the direction of the wave, it's going to reach this particular receptor 1 first, and some time later, it's going to reach this receptor. And how much time will it take? It will take basically this extra path length, which is b sine theta, divided by the speed of light. Radio waves travel at the speed of light. So some b sine theta over c time later, the same wave front is going to hit this receiver. So if we combine the signal from these two, and if we, let's say we want to add it in phase, then what we do is that we apply a delay to the signal that is received at the first receiver, corresponding to the time delay of b sine theta over c, so that when they reach, they are sort of in phase. This is how a detector works. You don't have to actually combine the signal in real time. You can record the voltages. The voltages, remember, represent the electric field of the incoming radio wave. The electric field of the incoming radio wave will induce a voltage in your antenna. Okay, and that voltage, of course, will change with time and frequency and so on. But you can record it at using this tape recorder, and then you can have antenna C, antenna B, antenna A sitting very far away from each other. And as we shall see in a few minutes, they could be thousands of kilometers away. And then those tape recordings can be brought together, played back, and everything can be brought into time synchronization, correcting for the geometric delay that we saw in the previous slide, and the signals can be combined. The atomic clock is basically just to record a very, very accurate timestamp for the signal as received at any of these three antennas. Okay, now a little bit of what interferometry actually does. Interferometry, radio interferometry, is essentially a Young's double slit experiment being carried out on a gigantic scale. All of you are familiar with this Young's double slit experiment, right? So that where this sort of pattern, which is like a sinc square kind of intensity pattern, is formed due to constructive and destructive interference occurring for the light that is entering this area from the slit at the top and the slit at the bottom. Changing the distance d seems to change the distance between the fringes. If you bring the slits closer together, the peaks of the intensity distribution on the screen will move further apart. If you increase the distance between if you increase the distance d between the two slits, then these fringes will come closer together. Of course, you have to make sure that the light is going through is coherent, okay? Because if it is not coherent, right? For example, if you make the slits too wide, then bad things begin to happen, and the intensity pattern that you're seeing on the screen will begin to fade. In the radio, what we are measuring, you can think of the two radio dishes as little slits that are gathering data. And you're not gathering data anywhere else. You're only gathering the radio data at the slits. Now, why does this work like a double slit experiment? Because remember, the wavelength compared to the optical is 2 million times larger. So you should make the slit diameter also 2 million times larger, right? And the slit separation can also become 2 million times larger than what you do with an optical experiment. And then you will get the exact same thing. So if I have a uniform intensity which is falling onto these two slits, I get this kind of intensity pattern, this kind of interference fringes on my screen. Similarly, on my receiver, okay, I should see the this kind of pattern, fringing pattern on my detector. Now there is a relationship between the intensity that you have passing through here and the mapping in the form of these fringes. And that comes out is governed by something known as the Fourier transform. So if you have a function x of t and you want to obtain its Fourier transform at some angular frequency omega, then you have to simply carry out this integral and you will get the Fourier transform. You can also define the inverse Fourier transform, which means you start with this function x of omega and you take the inverse Fourier transform of x of omega and you'll go back to x of t, which is given here. And again, you're basically just inverting this integral and going from here, you're going from the t space, time space, let's say, to frequency space. And here you're going from the frequency space to the time space, right? Now, just to remind you of the Young's double slit experiment, if you have a single opening, so this is like a step function, the Fourier transform of a step function is this pattern, which is the sinc function. If you have two step functions, which will correspond to the two slits, then the Fourier transform of that pattern will be a sinc square kind of function. So it doesn't have any negative values. The minimum value there would be 0, and which is exactly what you see on screen. So what you're seeing here is that the telescope or these slits, what you're measuring on the screen is not the intensity of the object that you're seeing on the sky directly, but the Fourier transform of that intensity as it illuminates these two slits. So that's the basic idea. So you suppose I have a dish here and I have a dish there. On my detector, okay, so if I had a detector that detects the intensity of the light, what I will see is a fringe pattern that corresponds to the baseline or the line connecting these two dishes. And it's exactly happening like as shown here. There is an interference pattern that is formed by the incoming plane light front passing through two apertures. Okay, this is, one has to be a little careful. I've done some kind of oversimplification here, because remember, these are not slits, but these are two circular apertures. So if you look at diffraction through two circular apertures and the interference pattern that they form, then this would be an exact analogy. Now you can take two different pairs or three different pairs as shown here of antennas. So I take this antenna at top right and the one at sort of center left, and that gives me interference fringes which look like this, right? The direction of these fringes depends on the, will usually be perpendicular to the baseline that is being measured. So if you're measuring a nearly horizontal baseline, you will get somewhat vertical fringes. So over here, we are measuring the fringes formed by these two dishes together, and those are shown here, right? And similarly, for the third pair of antennas, I will have another pair of fringes. So if you have n antennas, you will have NC2, n combination 2 pairs of baselines, which will give you that many fringes. And if you just combine all the fringes together, then this begins to represent the Fourier transform of the intensity of the sky. Okay. And then if you take an inverse Fourier transform of that, you can get a map, an intensity map of the object that you're staring at. So this is our synthesized aperture. So this is the GMRT as, for example, or the VLA. This Y-shaped configuration is what you are able to see as the view. You're basically measuring the Fourier transform of the intensity of whatever object these dishes are looking at the moment. But there's also Earth rotation. Okay, so if I'm, imagine you're sitting on the object which is emitting these radio waves, you will see that as time goes on, these arrays will appear to rotate, primarily because of the rotation of the Earth. Okay, and the configuration of the array will change with time, and this particular aperture will begin to fill up. If this aperture fills up completely with yellow dots, then you have gathered the full information as you would gather as with a single dish with a diameter of, in the case of the GMRT, 25 kilometers. So you can see that Earth rotation helps us sample more points in this Fourier transform domain, so that when we take the inverse Fourier transform, the fidelity of the image that we create is very high. So all of this thing, the correlation of the various baselines is done via a device known as a correlator, where the signals from different antennas, the 30C2 or 435 baselines of the GMRT, they're combined using computers which are sitting in this particular room. So to summarize why Fourier transforms or why radio interferometry works is that if you take the electric field as measured at by antenna R1, okay, and you multiply that with the complement of the complex complement of the electric field as measured at antenna 2, and you multiply these two complex numbers together, one representing the electric field at dish 1 and the other representing the electric field at dish 2, and you average over a period of time to take care of noise fluctuations, you will get what is called the visibility of R1 and R2. And it turns out, like I tried to illustrate using those pictures, that these visibilities are the Fourier transform of the intensities on the sky. So that is what is represented by this second line over here. So if this is what I measure. If I take the inverse Fourier transform of that, so the inverse Fourier transform of the Fourier transform of a function is the function itself. And therefore, I'll be able to get at what I really want to measure, which is the intensity distribution of radio light on the sky. Now, as I said, we can record these intensities. You don't have to do this process is the correlation process. You don't have to do the correlation in real time. With the atomic clock, if you can simply record the data, then you can bring the data together and do a playback experiment and just combine the data on a computer system many, many months later. So this allows for a technology called VLBI, Very Large Baseline Interferometry. In this, you don't have your dishes separated by a few kilometers. You have your dishes separated by few thousands or few tens of thousands of kilometers. So an experiment was done about 3 or 4 years ago, wherein you had one telescope in Europe, the IRAM 30 meter, one big telescope ALMA, and Apex, another smaller telescope in Chile, the South Pole telescope in Antarctica, the sub-millimeter array and the James Clerk Maxwell telescope in Hawaii, and the sub-millimeter telescope in the United States, and the large millimeter telescope in Mexico, all of which looked at a nearby galaxy called M87. And they recorded data. Okay. And of course, you have to record and keep. The South Pole telescope is not accessible for about 6-7 months a year. So you have to wait for spring before you can reach the telescope and take out the disk. But from other places, simply it's possible to courier the disks, hard disks around, and the data set can be combined. So these are the actual physical hard disks that were transported from all of these telescope locations to a centralized location where the correlation was carried out and an inverse Fourier transform was obtained. Now, why do we want these large separation between the telescopes? Our resolution. Okay, we want high resolution for this particular experiment. Remember, it's 1.22 lambda by d. So if d goes from a few tens of kilometers to 10,000 kilometers, you can get 1,000-fold increase in resolution. And that resolution enabled us to make this particular image. I'm sure many of you have seen the black hole image of the central black hole sitting at the center of the galaxy M87 in the Virgo cluster, which was imaged with the Event Horizon telescope. Okay, this telescope is called the Event Horizon telescope because it is designed to obtain directly an image of the black hole event horizon of a supermassive black hole sitting at the centers of galaxies. To give you a scale of the size, there is the sun that is shown here and the orbit of Pluto, and Voyager 1 is shown. So the little black circle that you see at the center is not much bigger than our solar system. But since it's located in a galaxy far, far away, you need very high angular resolution. The angular resolution here is about 43 micro arc seconds. This is equivalent to being able to resolve out a tennis ball on the moon. It's that high resolution. So this is completely unprecedented. Now we know that one way of improving resolution is to increase D, but you can also improve resolution by decreasing lambda. Okay, the numerator 1.22 lambda by D. So this particular telescope operated in the submillimeter and millimeter bands, which is many hundreds of times higher frequency than what the GMRT or the VLA use. So you, with a shorter wavelength radio telescope and or a higher frequency radio telescope and very high separations between the telescope elements, one can obtain images like this one. Okay, now I will, in the last 10-15 minutes, I'm going to talk about challenges for the telescope like the GMRT and what we are doing to improve things. Okay, so the biggest challenge for a telescope like the GMRT is radio frequency interference. Okay, because man-made signals, radio signals are everywhere. We use cell phones everywhere. We use Wi-Fi and so on, but we also generate inadvertently lots of radio frequency interference. So if you have a motorcycle and you kickstart the motorcycle, then the spark plug which gets the engine going, that spark plug will generate radio frequency interference. And with a super sensitive telescope like the GMRT, one spark plug going off nearby will really damage the signal that we are receiving quite irretrievably. Okay, so it's a very, 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 very difficult problem. It's a problem that is more severe naturally in areas that are very densely populated, like India. It is less so of a problem for telescopes that are located in other locations, in more remote locations. We also have other telescopes that are competing with us. So that is always there. There are many, many telescopes that have been built or have been upgraded in the last decade or so, which provide very strong competition to the GMRT. I've listed some telescopes here, but eventually we are going to build something that is going to be like the mother of all telescopes, which is called the Square Kilometre Array. We also have issues of limited human resources. People who work at the GMRT work in fairly challenging conditions. There is always the incentive from industry to get a more lucrative, financially lucrative job in the industry. So managing with our limited human resources is a real challenge. Nevertheless, we've carried out over the last 7 or 8 years a very ambitious upgrade of the GMRT. So what is shown on the x-axis is the frequency of operation, and what is shown on the y-axis is the root mean square sensitivity for a 9-hour-long observation with various telescopes, right? So you want to be at the bottom of the diagram. That means your sensitivity is highest. And as you can see, except for the SKA, which is represented by these 3 stars and the black color, within the frequency range of the GMRT's operation, which is goes from this point on the left and these 2 other 3 points on the right, we are the most sensitive. The upgraded GMRT will be the most sensitive radio telescope in the world, except at the highest frequencies where MeerKAT is quite close to our operations. Okay, so when we want to build the next generation radio telescope, what is it that we are looking at, right? So obviously we're looking at improved sensitivity. We want to study fainter and fainter sources. So we need more collecting area. So the bigger. It's like the optical telescopes. Guys want to build bigger and bigger optical telescopes so that they collect more photons and they're able to detect fainter objects. We would also want to go to a good site where the lower frequency, radio frequency interference is very low. Okay, quiet site and short integrations. And so by short integrations, one means that you just average over a very short period of time, so that if a spark plug goes off and let's say half a second of data are damaged, you throw away only that much data and you use the rest of the data. You also need low noise electronics so that the noise that is introduced, the system noise that is introduced by your own electronics is minimized. You also want wider frequency coverage, so that it turns out that at higher frequencies, dishes like the GMRT or the VLA dishes are very efficient. But at lower frequencies, below say about 150 megahertz or so, it is these aperture arrays or dipole arrays that are most efficient for wide frequency coverage. So if you want wide frequency coverage, you build both dishes and aperture arrays. You want high instantaneous bandwidth, so you build these wideband feeds and wideband and electronics that support signals at different frequencies. You need better resolution, so you need long baselines. You also need short baselines, because it is the short baseline that allows you to detect objects with low surface brightness. So for that, you have short baselines. You want better UV coverage, which means you want to sample the Fourier plane with Earth rotation aperture synthesis as completely as possible. So the more baselines you have, the more dishes or aperture arrays you have, the better it is. So have more dishes, both at long and short distances. You want better spectral resolution, so you want more channels, but you have to worry about the fact that this will lead to very high data rates. You want a faster survey speed. So the telescopes that we have looked at so far, like the GMRT or the VLA, all have single pixel feeds, which means you're measuring one voltage with one dish at one frequency at one time. But you can have many different receivers at the focus and generate what are called multi-pixel feeds. At the same time, you have constraints. Cost will become a very big constraint if you want to build a telescope that's very ambitious. So one mitigation strategy is to use international cooperation. Many countries can come together and decide to build the telescope together. There are lots of technology constraints on manufacture and maintenance and upgrades and feeds and front-end electronics, signal transport, back-end electronics, offline processing, archiving. Everything is limited by the available technology. But the good thing, of course, is that this is not constant. The technological constraints tend to decrease with time, so you can build a more ambitious telescope in later years. Computing becomes a challenge. Okay, if you have n dishes, then the number of correlations, this NC2 correlations, begin to go approximately as n square. So if you have 100 dishes instead of 50, you will have 4 times as many correlations, not twice. You need lots of CPU, hard disk to store the data, RAM to do the processing, and so on. Even the power bills become a factor. The GMRT electricity bill is about 1 crore per year. And of course, while doing all this, you have to make sure that you don't generate radio frequency interference yourself. To avoid radio frequency interference from external factors, you have to go to very remote sites, but that leads to its own challenges of logistics at very remote sites. Okay, so the idea was that, okay, let's once and for all build a telescope and be done with it. So people came up with this very ambitious idea called the square kilometer array. which would have 3,500 dishes, 250 aperture array stations with about 100,000 elements, 800 terabit per second signal transport, and a supercomputer giving you 10 raised to 15 flops as a correlator, and prodigious data to store, at least half a exabyte per year, 50 to 100 megawatt power consumption, needs its own power plant, and estimated cost was 2 billion euros, right? And so then we started to build a telescope like this. After a lot of discussion, it was agreed that we will build 2 telescopes, one in South Africa and one in Australia. The dishes, the higher frequency component will get built in Southern Africa, and the aperture array stations, the dipole arrays, will get built in Australia. This is also not the full 3,500 dishes, for example, but only about 200 dishes, somewhat larger than the original design. So they'll have about 10% of the collecting area. With the aperture array stations, the collecting area is a larger fraction of the square kilometer array. But it was decided to build it in 2 phases because there simply isn't enough money to build the whole telescope at once. Nevertheless, you need an international collaboration. There are many countries that are interested in joining, are already part of the collaboration. There are more that are interested in joining, and this situation is fluid. I mean, since I made this slide, there have been some updates, and some of the countries like Spain and Portugal and so on have graduated to full members. Okay, so I'm going to end with a short video which shows you the whole telescope. And this is just about 3-minute long video. I'll give you a commentary as the video plays, and then we'll stop and take questions. So this was a video which was made about 10 years ago, and it shows the full SK, which we are not going to build in phase 1. What you see here are these individual dishes. And you can see there are many hundreds of them spread across a very large area. This again is the full SK. Now we're building only about 10% of the dishes. Each dish is individually steerable and can point to the same object, or you can split up the dishes so that some of them are looking at object 1 and the others are looking at object 2, and a third set is looking at object 3, and so on. All of these dishes are supposed to move in like 3 dimensions. So those are the dishes. The second component, which will now be built not next to the dishes, but on a different continent in Australia, are these aperture array stations. That SUV that you see in the background is to give you a size scale. The design of the sparse aperture arrays has changed somewhat now over the last decade. There's also a plan to build a dense aperture array wherein these are still dipoles but are closely separated from, the separation between them is very small. And each of these circles that you see is a dense aperture array station. At the moment, there is no plan to build the dense aperture array at all. But when it will be built in South Africa, right next to the dishes which are being built. Now, this is just the core of the square kilometer array. As you go further and further, just like the GMRT has these dishes spread far away, this one will have stations which are spread far away, and there will be groups of stations at larger and larger distances. The idea is to distribute things over thousands of kilometers in a sort of spiral, five-fingered spiral pattern. The website www.sktelescope.org has a lot of details. Again, I caution here that this video that I showed you was just a dramatic representation of what will come when the full SK is built. What we are building now is going to take us a decade, and we are going to build 10% of this. But nevertheless, it is a very, very large, challenging project. Okay, so with that, I will stop, and I'll go back to my slides and take your questions.
Sir. Hello.
Yes, Himansh.
1 second. Yes, Himansh. Yeah, go ahead, Himansh.
Sir, is it possible to do parallax-based experiments with radio interferometry?
What do you mean by that?
As in computing,
space
computing direct parallaxes of very distant galaxies or very distant objects and getting distances to them.
Because the parallax will be very small.
Yes,
see,
and
with VLBI, even with VLBI, the resolution that you're getting is not good enough to allow you to do parallax for distant objects. I mean, you could still possibly do parallax for solar system objects and things like that. Okay, so if you're looking at a parallax distance to Jupiter, you would see the parallax on those scales, on 10,000 kilometer scales, but not for distant galaxies and so on. No way.
I see. Also, the aperture synthesis thing. So if you want to, like in some sense, rotate your the Y-shaped array to fill your complete circle. So is it better to construct radio telescopes near the north and south pole instead of the equatorial region, because through the Earth's rotation you will be able to.
No, the problem with the North Pole, besides the obvious logistical problems, the problem with North Pole and South Pole is that at the North Pole you will see only half the sky at best, right? And also, if it is near the horizon, so suppose you put one at the North Pole and you want to observe, let's say, the Orion Nebula or something like that, which is close to the celestial equator, it will be very close to the horizon. And therefore, the beam that you get, the synthesized beam that you will get from your telescope will be so distorted, it will be so elliptical that it will not be very useful. So you don't generally want to put it either, I mean, you want to put it closer to the equator so that you can see most of the sky. And you want to put additional telescopes in the north and in the south, which can observe northern and southern objects more efficiently. So for example, if you want to observe the center of our galaxy, it's better to put a telescope in the southern hemisphere. And that is why the SK, both the SK telescopes are in the southern hemisphere. Many optical telescopes are in the southern hemisphere. But you don't want to miss out on what's happening in the northern sky. So you put some telescopes in the north as well. So there is no advantage, particular advantage of putting it at the poles.
Okay, I see.
Okay, I see.
Another question: what are radio recombination lines?
Okay, so there are some transitions, okay, which are what are called forbidden transitions, right? And it's only under very, very specific physical conditions do those transitions occur, okay? And when those transitions occur, you get these kind of recombination. Recombination lines is basically where you have element or a compound that is in the ionized form, and it comes back into a sort of bound form and releases a photon because it jumps into a lower energy state. And there are very many of these kind of recombination lines which are there in the radio from various kinds of molecules primarily, which they're called radio recombination lines because they're seen in the radio.
Okay, and so in the slide that you showed about upgraded GMRT and Meerkat and SK and all these things, there was this thing called confusion written in it. What was that?
Okay, so what happens is that if you become, let's look at an image. Okay, let me show you the one radio image that I had. Okay, so if you take a radio image like continuum radio image like this, right? Now, suppose I build a bit bigger and better telescope and I make a more sensitive observation. So what will I detect? I'll detect more and more fainter sources. Correct? Now, if I build an even more sensitive telescope, I'll detect more and more sources. Eventually, a stage will be reached where this whole screen will be black because there will be a source in every direction that I stare at. Moreover, what will begin to happen is that in every point spread function, see, remember, I've got limited resolution, even with a radio telescope or optical telescope, there is a limit. So within one point spread function, if I start seeing multiple sources, then my measurement of flux becomes unreliable. Correct? Why does it become unreliable? Because I'm measuring I want to measure the flux of, let's say, one galaxy, but at the same position, there are now 100 faint galaxies within my beam. And I'm detecting all of them because my sensitivity is so good. So when I measure the flux of my galaxy, it is going to be contaminated by the flux from these 100 faint galaxies. That leads to a noise in my measurement, which is referred to as the confusion noise. And that sets a limit. So for every telescope at a given frequency, there is a different confusion limit. Right? And this limit will change as a function of frequency, because as you go to higher frequencies, the size of the point spread function, the size of the beam for a given telescope will be smaller. And because it's smaller, the probability of having additional faint sources in the beam is also smaller. So the confusion limit will be lower or fainter. So that's why that confusion, basically it sets a limit on how deep you can go by building bigger and bigger telescopes. It's some kind of a natural limit of the telescope. You can't do better than that. So as you saw, almost all the telescopes are well above those points. So we are not yet confusion limited. So even the square kilometer array phase 1 will not be confusion limited. You can see these black points. They're still above the confusion limit. But if you build something, say 1,000 times more sensitive than the square kilometer array, you'll have this problem.
I see. Also, when you explained the baseband thing, so we are
Yes.
converting everything to the baseband, and how do you extract the frequency information of the source?
You know how much you are shifting it by, no? Because of the local oscillator. You know how much you are shifting it by. In fact, to get it into the baseband, you will have to change the local oscillator settings so that you bring it to 0 to 40 hertz. But from the other original settings of the feed and so on, and the RF amplifier, you know which frequencies you're receiving, which frequencies you're filtering out, which frequencies you're amplifying and taking forward. All that is known. So you're right. You can't measure it by measuring the frequency of the signal in the baseband. Yes, it'll always be between 0 to 400 megahertz. But by knowing the provenance of how that signal came to be, you can calculate it. And that is one of the metadata, important metadata that you record for the observation.
Also, how do you conduct spectroscopy in the radio wavelength? I mean, for optical, you can have things like prisms and gratings and all that.
Correct. So yeah, so in radio, the beauty is that the spectroscopy comes for free. In optical, you have to fight for the spectroscopy. In the sense that in the radio, what you do is that the signal that you receive, you can send different frequencies to different channels. So let us say I am observing at 1 gigahertz and I have, let's say, 1,000 channels in, let's say, 100 megahertz bandwidth, right? Then each channel corresponds to a different frequency, a different wavelength. So I'm actually measuring the spectrum by separately processing each channel. So you get it for free. And with the GMRT, you can calculate the sort of resolution you get, and you will find that it's about 10,000. Very high resolution. I mean, in optical, they'll call it high resolution spectroscopy, where lambda over delta lambda is 10,000. So that's why when you get the line, I mean, you have to do something special to get a continuum image. To get a continuum image, what you do is you average all channels together. So you say that between, let's say, 1 gigahertz and 1.1 gigahertz is my observation, and I'll just average across the frequency. So I get only one measurement. I mean, I don't get 100 or 1,000 measurements. I get only one measurement at sort of the average of the frequency band. So to get a continuum image, you just average over the frequency, average over all frequencies or all channels equivalently.
Okay. And was curious, what are the typical integration times or exposure times as a function of the flux density? Like for millijansky, how much integration do you need? For microjansky, how much integration do you need?
So if you want a millijansky RMS, just a few minutes with the GMRT is enough. For sort of 1 microjansky, which is the deepest we have reached with the GMRT, I think you need about 100 to 200 hours at one position. And nanojansky is still not reachable with GMRT. That will be SK domain. But even with SK, you are talking of the order of 1,000 hours, 2,000 hours for nanojansky level measurements.
Okay.
Okay, questions from others.
Quick question,
Yes.
sir. Is it possible to do
Yeah.
daytime observations using radio telescopes? Or is the sun still
Daytime?
too dominant?
Okay. Yeah. So the way it works is like for the GMRT, we need to keep about a 20 degrees distance from the sun. That's the only restriction that we have, because then what if you are within 20 degrees, then the sun will be in one of the side lobes of your telescope and begin to cause problems because it's such a bright source. So long as you keep the sun at least 20 degrees away from where you're observing, there is no problem. And other radio telescopes have similar constraints. All radio telescopes have no problem observing in daylight or even in totally cloudy weather. No problem. We don't have problems so long, even when it is raining, so long as it's not a thunderstorm and it's not very windy. Windy, of course, requires you to shut down the telescope. Thunderstorms can cause too much of radio frequency interference. It's like billions of spark plugs going off at the same time. So you don't want to observe when there is thunderstorm and meaning lightning in the air, and you don't want to observe. But otherwise, if it's like a quiet drizzle or something, you can observe even when it's raining. So that way we are very lucky compared to optical telescopes.
One more question, sir. So how much do solar flares or events that cause charged particles to pass through the magnetic field of the Earth, how much do they?
Yes.
And do they affect telescopes close to the poles?
Yes, so they affect the ionosphere quite severely, and changes in the ionosphere affect low frequency observations more severely than they do affect high frequency radio observations. So for the lower frequency bands of the GMRT, if the sun is very active, then the sort of radio frequency interference that we see from solar activity is much higher than we see at the highest GMRT frequencies. If you're observing at 150 megahertz, then it is possible that if the sun is particularly active today, it will damage the observation to an extent that you have to ask for makeup time. It can be completely devastating. So yes, our observation is affected by solar activity. So naturally, if you want to do a survey or something like that, some large program, you want to do it at a time of solar minimum, not at the time of solar maximum.
Understood, sir. Thanks.
More questions?
Sir,
Yes, Kapil.
Yeah, go ahead.
so you told us in the very beginning of the class that we using meshes to avoid like basically the wind doesn't disturb the
Yes.
but meshes are basically, as you said, they must have very high maintenance cost, making it like more difficult to manage.
Your voice was breaking up. Can one of you, maybe Varun, can you just repeat the question? It's about the meshes.
Actually, it's feedback coming from your side, Yogesh.
Okay, so let me
So
mute
if you
myself.
have headphones
and,
or yeah.
Yeah, no, I'll just mute myself and then only unmute when I answer.
Okay, that will be great. Thanks.
I'm muting. So why don't you repeat the question? I'm just going to mute myself.
Okay, so is it audible now?
Yes, go ahead, Kapil.
So in the beginning, you talked about that we are using meshes because the wind itself might disturb the dishes. So, but the mesh itself was made up of stainless steel wires, very thin wires, and the wires themselves must have very high maintenance cost or maintenance towards it, because like they must rust. If like they are made of stainless steel, they must rust at some point, and considering they are really thin, their resting time must also be small. So are they like replaced irregularly or something, or what?
Yeah,
Yogesh?
yeah. Thank
Yeah.
you for your question. Huh. So now I've unmuted myself. You can hear me, right?
Yes.
Huh. So yes. So first of all, one uses stainless steel, not regular steel, which takes a much longer time to rust than regular steel. The second thing that you do is that if a little bit of the mesh is damaged, you will lose a little bit of your sensitivity. But we have 30 dishes, each of which is very large. So we don't generally replace the mesh, except in some specific situation where we find that the mesh is really looks damaged. Then not over the entire dish, but over a small section of the dish where it is most damaged. We have in the past replaced the stainless steel mesh, but it's exceedingly rare. You also have to remember that this mesh is useful provided the separation between the mesh nodes or the grid is much smaller than the wavelength that we are observing at. So already at 20 centimeters, which is the highest frequency or the shortest wavelength that we observe at, this begins to be a problem in the sense that the electric uh, field is not completely reflected, which means the incoming radio wave, some part of it just goes and hits the ground. It just goes through the mesh and doesn't get reflected, hits the ground, right? Then it's gone. We never measure that signal. So our sensitivity goes down. And therefore, the GMRT cannot observe at high frequencies. So suppose you want to make the GMRT observe at, say, 3 gigahertz or 4 gigahertz, that's never going to work, because as the frequency of the incoming, the wavelength of the incoming radiation becomes similar to the wavelength, closer to the wavelength of the or the separation between the mesh wires, more and more of the signal is going to leak through. And that is why we cannot go to higher frequencies. If you want to build a dish which operates even at higher frequencies, then you need a solid dish. So the square kilometer array, for example, is designed to operate up to about 15 gigahertz. And therefore, it does not have a mesh. It has a solid reflecting surface.
Okay, so got it. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, maybe we can take one more question if there's any. If not, let's thank Yogesh for the two great lectures, and we will, of course, upload this video and the slides from here as well, and some of the references related to this lecture quite soon. Two quick announcements, rather three. One is, remember that the assignment is due next week. The due date was set as Tuesday, which it turns out is a holiday, but the assignment is still due at the same time. So make sure you put it up. The second thing is, I've posted some rules about the EndSem. EndSem is going to be just 2 hours, not three, because it's also a 20 marks paper. And the third thing is that project presentations, I will post the rules in another 15 minutes. Presentations and vivas are going to be on the next weekend. So we will use about 3 hours of time on one day for presentations. You all have to be present for everybody's presentation. So mark that time, and you will actually be grading each other's presentations as well, and those marks will really count in your final marks. Um, And then lastly, there are 2 lectures next week. First lecture is on solar system objects that will be given by Dr. Bryce Boland from Caltech. And that lecture, because of the time zone difference, is scheduled at 9 p.m. on Thursday. I will post an announcement and link on Teams. And then the last lecture will be on the 16th, which will be by Archana Pai on gravitational waves. Okay, thanks a lot, everyone. Thanks again, Yogesh. Good day. Bye.
Thank you.